The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. And I've been broadcasting for 10 years, since 2014, and it's so wild to me how long I've been doing this. I'm your host, Carmen Spagnola, and I have definitely never had a hobby that kept me interested as long as this podcast. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples today, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. And welcome to my Witches New Year retreat. Of course, this is a podcast, so you could be listening to this at any time of year. But I had this idea that I would create a podcast series that you could listen to as a personal spiritual retreat to honor the season of the witch, the season of Halloween, Samhain, the season of the beloved dead, the evening of the year that leads us into the dark half of the wheel of the year. Now, if you have a copy of The Spirited Kitchen, I invite you to flip to page 217. I've got mine here. And you will see that on this page, there is a relatively small amount of text describing what is on the facing page, which is a photograph of several witch ladders. And so page 217, these are the instructions for how to make them. And let's both look upon this page with wonder and bemusement at the hundreds of pages of research and all the books I've read, the hours of lectures I watched delivered by various experts in folklore and folk magic, and the number of workshops I myself have taught about this particular form of ritual craft. And let's just sit back and shake our heads and wonder how all of that got compressed down into this teeny tiny amount of text. Here's the thing about writing a cookbook. So in your contract, they tell you how many words it has to be, right? You get a contract for to turn in a manuscript of however many thousand words. So mine was a contract for, I think, 45,000 words. And I trimmed my manuscript down to 80,000 words. And then we compromised at 65,000 words. And then what happens is they lay out the book, and they lay it out with photography. And there's a whole production designer along with your editor, and there's just a huge team of people. And then what happens is that sometimes, just to make things symmetrical and kind of make it so that there isn't one section of the book that drags on really long, and anyway, it gets cut. And it gets cut down, and you realize, there was a little more space on that page. But by then, they're no, we've got to get to production. We've taken stuff out, but you can't put stuff back in. We're moving along here. And by then you're a couple years into this process and you are so exhausted and you say, okay. And it's not until a couple years later that you're man, I still have things to say about witch ladders. I mean, it's fine. It's totally fine. I have a lot of information in my mind, and I have a lot of things I want to do. I got a million ideas, and they can't all be home runs, right? So it was good. My editor was no, keep it simple, and it's fine. Nobody needs to go that far down a rabbit hole into something so incredibly niche. Honestly, I get it. And I understand the feedback that sometimes I'm rambling about stuff that's kind of boring or tangential or extraneous, maybe right now, and people just want me to teach what I know. Just teach the stuff. And I do try. I try to stick to that principle of staying focused on what the people need to know and do to accomplish the task they are here to learn about. But I do wish that there were some things that were in the book that, I wish I'd been allowed to keep them in the book. I do wish I'd been allowed to dedicate more pages to some of these ritual crafts. But anyway, I understand it's already kind of a stretch for a publisher to create a cookbook that also has all this ritual craft in it, and that's also a spiritual book. So anyway, but here we are today, and I have stuff to say about witch ladders. if you don't know what a witch ladder is, it's probably helpful to see what one looks like. I will definitely link to some images in the show notes. But essentially, it's sticks. It's a handful of sticks. It's a few sticks that get tied onto a string, and they hang just like a ladder. And there are many cultures that have made witch ladders or things that look similar. So you will see things that look similar around the world, but mainly witch ladders are essentially a fairly modern folk practice, and something that is trying to evoke a Norse style is going to look different from something that's evoking an English Wiccan style. But that's the nice thing about folk magic traditions, is that they emerge partly from custom and habit and partly from a very specific time and place. Like there's a real make do with what have kind of vibe when it comes to this type of folk magic. Now, as I've said before on the podcast, the three foundational practices of magic are trance, divination, and ritual. A witch ladder is a form of not magic that fits under this umbrella of ritual, and what I would call a ritual craft. So it's this thing that you are making, but in the making of it, it is a ritual, or you could also say in the making of it, it is a spell. So this episode is for you to listen to while you are doing your ritual craft of making a witch ladder. So I'm going to read you the instructions from the Spirited Kitchen, and you should have already, or maybe you're listening to this as you are gathering the materials. And then as you set your hands to this ritual, maybe you will finish then listening to this episode. You can listen to some of the folklore that didn't make its way into the book. Okay, so here is the page titled Witch Ladders. This ritual is a form of not magic, where an intention is methodically bound into a talismanic object. As always, a clear, strong intention strengthens the spell significantly. A charm is spoken for each knot you make. Distill your intention to a short phrase you can easily remember and repeat. For instance, to call in Persephone, you might say, "I honor you, Persephone. Please be with me now." Repeat this as you tie each knot. Or you might have a more elaborate intention, such as, "This home is filled with love, trust, and harmony. Our bonds are secure. We nurture a culture of repair. We honor each other's spirit." For each knot, you'd repeat a key word, such as love, harmony, secure. The magic is bound at the end of the working with a declaration such as, "And so it is," or "My word is firm." To make your ladder, you will need twine, scissors, a few sticks that carry the right energy for your magical working, corresponding materials such as flowers, herbs, feathers, antlers, bones, nuts with holes drilled through them, dried apple or orange slices, beads, ribbons in symbolic colors, locks of hair, mementos, or heirlooms. Tie the sticks together using either one piece or two parallel lengths of twine, as is your preference. Your correspondences can be threaded onto the twine as you go along, or you can tie all the sticks together for your ladder first, then attach the correspondences after. Hang your ladder to anchor the energy in your space. There's like a little call-out box, a little side box that says, "Level up your knot magic." I use a specific knot called the constrictor knot, which is easy, elegant, and very secure. For a how-to demonstration, go to animatedknots.com. And of course, I will link to that in the show notes. So that's it, my friend. It's like half a page of instruction, but I I scoured so many books to try to figure out, like, where do they come from and tell me more about not magic. And all of it kind of got distilled into the essence. And that's really what my publisher wanted, is like, what's the essence of this? And what's the most kind of broadly applicable kind of instruction you can give so that we're not getting into a whole bunch of history and stuff. So here's the chance for you to learn all about the history. Okay, let's get my chapstick on. Have you got your mug of tea, or maybe some magic mushroom tea, or maybe you have some other hot drink, or you've got a snack, you've got your magical things all around you, your materia magica. Let's dive in to the history of the witch's ladder. So the first witch ladder that is really well documented and archived is in the archives of the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford in England. And it turns out this is like one of the foremost ethnographic museums in the world, and it has a very large collection of exhibits in this category called sympathetic magic. So surely if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know, like sympathetic magic is you're trying to create an action that will then be replicated in the unseen realms. So cures for warts, bewitched objects, folk magic talismans, all that kind of stuff is all in this Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford. There's like a desiccated onion from the 1820s that's like stuck with pins and stuff. That's like, it got an interesting story. Like apparently 4 of these pin-stuck onions were suddenly and mysteriously thrown into a pub one day, and the ale housekeeper, who was a wizard, immediately gathered them up and took them away, and he and others in the pub suspected they'd been thrown in by one of his local enemies, a man who was like a fierce advocate for temperance, which is so interesting because that's not the only curse I've ever seen where it was thought that the person who did the cursing was a temperance campaigner, which, you know, so temperance, right? Like anti-alcohol, like trying to make drinking illegal. And it's like, and yet you're creating curses. It's just, that's wild to me. So I don't know how true that story is. But anyway, the wizard was fine, but the next year, when his wife was struck down with a fever, it was written that there was, quote, much head shaking among the wise, that the ale housekeeper had been cursed. So, head shaking among the wise, that's like a good phrase to use. Anyway, the witch ladder in the museum archives has this like obscure and debated origin, and it looks a bit different from what we would be making today if we were in the same room, partly because the witch ladders we'd make are more the type that you would see made by like Gerald Gardner and other early practitioners of Wicca in the 1950s. And we think that Gerald Gardner and the early Wiccans interpreted what they saw displayed by what was then called the Folklore Society. And the artifacts of the Folklore Society eventually became the archives of the Pitt Rivers Museum. So that's kind of the lineage of it, is we think that the same witch ladder that we can now see in this museum is the one that the early Wiccans who developed that religion had seen, and they've kind of created, they just took some artistic liberty with it, right? Now, although witch ladders, which are a form of not magic, those are pretty, like a relatively recent evolution of folk magic. Not magic itself, on the other hand, is a category of magic that is incredibly old. We know that is quite ancient. Knots are like one of the earliest technologies developed by humans, and so employing not magic really puts us in touch with our very earliest ancestors. And, you know, when you think about technological developments, cordage, making cordage, and then tying it together and doing that in some kind of replicable way, like that definitely would have seemed like magic at the time. So yeah, we know that Neolithic humans were exceedingly dependent on textiles and cordage and basketry, like in other words, knots, because, metallurgy hadn't been invented yet. And remember, like for most of human history, there were no pockets, there were no zippers, there was no tape or Velcro, there was not even buttons. So for most of human history, our culture has been held together by knots and weaving, not nails, knots. And so when we see knots in pictographic records and archaeological records in the ancient arts, we know that it's more than just a knot. It's something magical. So the knot of Isis, for example, that would have been worn as a protective amulet. And Egyptians used knots as amulets because it was believed that that was a way to both bind and release magic. When we look at the Greek legends of the Gordian knot, it's a similar kind of idea. It's not just a knot, it's the knot of destiny. I think that the Gordian knot was like related to Alexander the Great, and kind of tied up with his personal mythology. The Greek Moirai, the Scandinavian Norns, like each set of these mythological archetypes who were oracular figures, they were weavers. They were weaving destiny by tying the threads of fate or cutting the threads of fate. So anytime you see weaving as a central activity in myth, you also know you're looking at something that's very similar to not magic, or it's something sort of not magic adjacent. This is why I could read like hundreds and hundreds of pages, but actually only come up with like a tiny amount that was related to witch ladders. And like I tried to put all this stuff in there and they were like, can we just trim this down even more? Because we're getting off topic here. But personally, I find it fascinating. Anyway, the Irish Trinity knot, that is another one that represents the inseparability of the Holy Trinity. And the triquetra image, like of the simple 3-loop knots, that's also found in several Buddhist artifacts. So there's been plenty of time for like pretty much every culture on earth to develop a robust repertoire of knot magic. Actually, one of the books I read that was just such a standout, and I didn't read it just for not magic. I was reading it for research for the Spirited Kitchen. It was called In the Bathhouse at Midnight, a historical survey of magic and divination in Russia. So good. It had quite a bit, too, in there, though, about the Mongolians, and things that had been happening in Siberia, etc. So they had a lot of phrases and words. And so the one word for wizard in Russian translates to knot tire. And similarly in Hebrew, one name for like an enchanter is one who ties magic knots. Fascinating. So knot magic, it can be either beneficent or maleficent. It can be for blessing or cursing. And the great thing about knot magic is it's effective either at close range or at long distance. It can work immediately or it can have slow release over time. And it's really easily used by anyone for either folk magic or ceremonial magic purposes. So talk about, just like you would expect from a knot, it's like extremely, supremely versatile and useful. The most common uses that we see in the archaeological record of folk magic practices, at least across Europe, my background that I know, and also I would say in Siberia, it seems to be that knot magic is mainly used in like 4 categories. One is like the weather, specifically the winds. And so there's some evidence we could see, like this makes sense if you're praying for your sailor or explorer husband to return home safely. So some knot magic around that, saying your prayers into the knots and like tying the knots as a way of almost like tying him to the ship, or like, tying things down to be more secure. The second category is like illness, plagues, death. And so having a witch ladder like hung outside your door to stop them from entering your home, it's like every knot you tied in your witch ladder would have had this charm that you uttered. And so it's like repeating itself over and over again, hanging outside your front door. The third category that's super common is like marriage, sex, conception, childbirth. So like basically manifesting love, but abundance as well. Everything to do with like fertility and conception in old knot magic. You can also pretty much use that same magical practice, those same spells for abundance, wealth, prosperity, because having offspring was your security, was your prosperity in many ways. And so sometimes witch ladders, they could be hung in the bedroom or outside the door of the bedroom, but also sometimes they were not hung. These garlands, the witch ladders were sometimes called garlands, would be placed under the mattress. And then the fourth category is like the spirits, demons, deities. So either invoking and anchoring a deity into a space or just protection against demons and that sort of thing. And there's like well-documented Italian curses using witch ladders in this way. The witch ladder that's at the Pitt Rivers Museum is one that was found in an old house in Somerset in the UK. And that house was demolished in 1878. And when they demolished it, there was this room that was inaccessible from the interior of the house. And it separated the roof from the upper room. It was like, it was like a 13th floor in a house. Like, it's like, what? If you know that reference, well, Google it if you don't know 13th floor reference. Anyway, it was like this place that was sort of not connected to the house, was not the attic, but was in between. And so they're demolishing this house and they discovered this like secret low-ceilinged area, this room, and in it was an old armchair and like half a dozen old brooms and a rope with feathers woven into it. And I'll put a image of that in the show notes for you. And it creeped the workers out, totally creeped them out. And then it found its way to the Folklore Society. As I mentioned, in Italy, there were discoveries of something very similar. And so it seems that the witches in Italy used this similar form called like a witch's garland. And it was also made of cord, and it contained black hen feathers. Traditionally, this was a curse, though. So in that area, they would have a malediction. It was like a little curse would be uttered as each knot was tied. And then, they would put it under the victim's bed. Super creepy. Imagine finding like a garland of black chicken feathers under your bed. Odd. And so then these types of garlands, these witch ladders that are just cordage and feathers, are the precursors to the more modern witch ladders that we see now, the Wiccan style. So, in the more modern take on the witch ladder, sometimes there's beads on a cord. Sometimes there's one recorded that's like 40 beads with 40 knots, which is interesting because those are even numbers, obviously, whereas other witch ladders they seem to go more for odd numbers. And I even have seen it saying it's only ever in odd numbers, which could be 3 or 9 or 13 knots. So, it varies. But once finished, the beads or knots of the witch ladder, it's sort of like it enables the witch to concentrate on repetitive chants or incantations. And it's a little like a rosary, right? Like you're creating it, and then you are focusing your intention into this knot and into this object, this talismanic object that you're making, and channeling a ton of energy towards this desired goal. Now, sometimes, like we see other modern inventions, like the Valhalla ladder. And those are like those driftwood garlands you'll see as part of like the set deck on shows like Vikings. It's like if you ever watched a Viking show, and they'll have these like driftwood long garlands hanging down from the boughs of trees or outside temples and things like that. Nowadays, people are making those as a kind of protective talisman to hang outside the home. Again, totally modern invention. And I don't know how much it is the invocation part. Like, I don't know how important utterances are with those, because they are such a modern kind of invention. I was not able to find anything convincing that made me go like, aha, this Freya's ladder or this Valhalla ladder has some earlier folk practice in Scandinavia. If you found something, I'd love to know. You can leave me feedback on castfeedback.com/Numinous Podcast. Anyway, even if they're a totally modern invention, let's not malign the word invention. Folk magic is inventive. As I said, it's make do with what have. That's the style of magical practice, is you are finding mainly natural materials or significant little mementos, little objets, materia magica, and it means something to you. And the knot magic, just the tying of the knots, is connecting you with this sort of the ancient psyche, that we are binding something and securing that. And so we're securing and affixing that intention into the fabric of the cosmos. I think it's beautiful, but it's also profound. So modern invention mainly, but the witch ladders that I make, they're mainly like natural materials that I'm just finding, or sometimes I seek them out. I'll seek out special woods, like I said, feathers. Sometimes I use dried flowers. Sometimes it is fresh and I just let them dry there. I often use things like grains. Grains are very important offerings for me. So sometimes I'll grow like just a little bit of wheat or a little bit of oats, and I love putting that in. I love using bones and antlers, and I've gotten more courageous with using the drill to go through things like chestnuts. I've done hazelnuts, walnuts and walnut shells, seashells. When I'm wanting to affix things like crystals or, mainly crystals and stones, I will use copper wire or other kinds of wire and wrap them first, and then I'll just tie them on that way. I really like having an anchor at the bottom that, for me, like whatever anchors my witch ladder, the thing that goes at the very bottom of the ladder, I think of that as being connected to the roots or the underworld. So I often have symbols there that either feel connected to my own personal ancestry, so that I feel rooted like with the ancestors, those under the earth, or I just connect some kind of memento mori, like a skull or like a bead in a skull or a bone or something like that. Hagstones I really like to use as well. Hagstones being those stones, like when they get a perfect hole that gets worn away in a stone. That's what a hagstone is. The myth is that you would look through one of those hagstones and you can see the other world through it. Anyway, I like to have those on the bottom. I've also used things like horsehair. Had little snippets of horsehair and made a little tassel out of that. I like using wool because it connects me with like sheep and, again, Scottish Highlander ancestors. I've used butterfly wings to represent Mercury. And then I'll sometimes use metal things or plastic things, little trinkets that I will tie on. And sometimes I also use color magic. So ribbon is really nice for that, but I also will sometimes take embroidery floss and wrap the sticks that are used as like the ladder part of the ladders, and I'll wrap the sticks with embroidery floss to represent a certain energy. I've also used jewelry to like tied on rings or thread the cordage through the rings and things like that. Now, when it comes to the actual sticks, I very often will just gather windfall from the ground. It's really easy. It doesn't hurt any tree, but also because my ancestor tree, the ash tree in my backyard, it's frequently losing, like the dried tips of branches. So it's really easy for me to do. But also, when it's pruning time, I will definitely be like, yeah, I'm pruning the hazelnut or something, I'm doing a little, coppicing, and hazelnut trees, because they're so connected with wisdom and divination. Hazel trees were used, the wood was used for making wands and things like that. So I love using the hazel as well. And when I make a witch ladder for my home and the protection of the occupants, I'll usually select a stick for each human and animal that lives in my home or in the property. And that way I'm including all of us in this ritual craft as a prayer of protection. But also, if I'm making a witch ladder for like a special time of year, because you can make them anytime, but if I'm making it for like one of the sort of primary festivals of the Wheel of the Year, like Samhain or Belton, I might see if I can find a piece of wood from each of the 9 sacred woods. And I talk about the 9 sacred woods in the Spirited Kitchen as well. It's another modern tradition. It's like a neo-Druidic tradition, but it does have roots in this idea that the Druids were tree worshippers, right? And the Wiccans recognized the 9 sacred woods too, but Druids are mostly associated with doing their magical rites in a sacred grove of trees, especially oak trees. And if I were sort of like gonna get all 9 sacred woods together, I would know that this was like a very potent, but also almost like it's elevating my folk magic just a little bit. It's not quite high magic yet, perhaps, where it's, highly ceremonial, but it is an extra special, extra step, I guess you could say, to try to get the 9 sacred woods. So if there was some kind of intention that you were weaving in that felt kind of like a Mac Daddy, felt like a big one, and you wanted to get the 9 sacred woods, then you would be looking for alder, which is connected to shielding and clearing energy and has a protective vibe to it. You would want to get ash, which is connected to abundance, prosperity, health, and transformation. Birch, which is often connected to new beginnings, renewal, change, and also like communal, and some would say like feminine energy. I think of birch as kind of being related to like the work bees that women would have around like domestic labor. It's like the tree equivalent of like a walking song, It just has a real communal energy to it. Hawthorn, which is connected to happiness and nature, but especially to fairies and druid magic. Hazel, which I mentioned, is connected with magic, wisdom, dreams, prosperity. Then we have oak, which is about abundance, success, confidence. Then rowan, which is about success and power, protection, life force energy. Willow, which is connected to divination, intuition, and self-efficacy and mastery. And finally, yew, which is connected to the ancestors and regeneration and cycles of birth and death. But definitely, you can use any old sticks you find out on the street for the steps of your witch ladder. That's fine. I've seen folks use mugwort stems, yarrow stems. As I mentioned, I often use bones, stones, or you could totally just use feathers like the Somerset witch ladder. Just use what you've got. Use what you think looks pretty. Use what feels potent. Use what represents the magic you're seeking to invoke, right? See, I am not a pagan reconstructionist, meaning I'm not trying to revive or like faithfully recreate old customs. I love knowing the origin and the history of things. That helps me be prudent and discerning, so I'm not like appropriating stuff or doing something inappropriate. I just don't think that practices that are modern or practices that deviate from old customs in new and creative ways are any less valid forms of spiritual practice. So it's a balance, you know. I very much believe that we should adapt our spiritual practices and our ritual crafts to feel relevant for our times. You'll see in Spells for the Apocalypse, which is my next book coming out in January, that I actually think we should even include plastics and really anything that's available to us, we should make sacred. That's the way of a folk tradition. It's going to evolve over time and in different places. And I do think they should be rooted for sure. And I think they should be accountable for sure. But they don't necessarily have to be rooted in the past or accountable in the past. They could also be rooted in the present. And like when I say plastics, it's like, you know, this is going to be precious material in collapse times, in deindustrialization times, 200, 300 years from now. So I think as we evolve ritual craft and weave it into our lives, maybe we could also think about being rooted in and accountable to present day intersections and relationships, but also think about who we are accountable to in the future. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing. Okay. It's probably okay if I have a bit of a tangent here, right? Because you're busy doing ritual craft right now, or you're busy gathering materials or something, right? So here's like a little bit more philosophical story time for your Not Magic. When I think about adapting customs to suit the present day, I think about bringing the customs of my Scottish Highlander ancestors here to where I live in Canada, for sure. I'm frequently thinking about what's appropriate. Like, when I say I use wool and yarn, I'm often kind of torn on that because I love sheep and I definitely associate them with Scotland, but I also associate them with the greatest heartbreak of Scotland, which is the Highland clearances, where the Scottish people were moved off their land so that sheep could be placed there, you know? Like, I don't know if you know this, but it's like, I think it's important. So yes, I'm going to share it. I acknowledge and learn from the history of my ancestors, you know, and when I think about the trauma that those ancestors experienced, I have to think about then what would that have been like when those Scottish ancestors displaced from the Highlands because of the Jacobite uprisings, you know, what was that like when they came to what we now call Canada? And we actually see tons of evidence of friendly relations between the Highlanders specifically and the Indigenous peoples of what we call Canada. And I mean, that makes sense, right? Because the British used all their ethnocidal tactics on the Scottish and the Irish before they exported those genocidal strategies to Canada, like right down to the attempted eradication of the Scottish Gaelic language and the Gaelic language, sending these little Scottish kids who only spoke Gaelic to English-speaking school, putting dunce caps on them, you know, being physically abusive if they used their language, separating siblings, making it illegal for families to speak their language in public, making their attire illegal. So like the tartans and the patterns that they were wearing, like for a time after the Battle of Culloden, it was illegal to wear tartan kilts. So the long story short is like those first Scottish settlers coming to Canada were the ones who were forced off their lands in Scotland. They were like loaded onto ships in the New World. And that was because the British at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were making so much more money on wool. And so they wanted to get rid of all the people. The Scottish folks were forced off that land to be replaced by sheep because of that booming wool industry. And so upon arrival in Canada, the Scots didn't speak English. They wore unusual clothing. They were very adept at hunting and living off the land. And they came from a clan-based society. So they actually had a lot in common with the Indigenous tribes here. So this is how trade and a lot of intermarriage began. That's why, at least here on the West Coast, this is why when you meet an Indigenous person, like where I live, if you meet a Salish person and they say they have some white ancestors, they are usually saying they have Scottish or Irish ancestry. And I had one Indigenous friend. She was from back east though, but she called herself Anishinaabe instead of Anishinaabe because half her family was Irish, the other half was Anishinaabe. So anyway, there's many things about the Indigenous cultures and customs that I love that have been shared with me over the years, and some practices that have been shared with me by local Indigenous elders that I don't talk about really because I feel so protective of that information and sharing that's been given to me. Again, not in like a white savior kind of way, but in like a John Brown, Harper's Ferry kind of way, like going to war with whiteness kind of way, where I'm just like not going to allow things to be stolen without speaking up or stepping in. So I carry all of that in when I'm placing wool in my witch ladder, or, when I'm thinking about what is it that what's the intention that I have. And when I'm like creating folk magic, not just witch ladders, but all kinds, I use the past as a landmark and a place to return to in my heart, but it's kind of like going back to a fork in the road. And I imagine somewhere back in time that maybe one of my Scottish ancestors coming to so-called Canada could have chosen like an even different path, could have been even more committed to solidarity, and could have been even more committed to exposing the harms. Though, I don't know, we see it now. We see people expose terrible ethnocidal things, and it still happens because they're not in power. But I just think it's important to understand what our history is so that as we now in the present day embrace land-based practices and we create new folk practices and we relate to the like ecologically oriented practices of our ancestors who will share a lot of common attitudes with Indigenous folks all over the world, even as we're doing all of that, we're still recognizing that settler colonialism is alive and well today. And so in order to be in alignment with the greater benevolent powers, I have to be careful as I am evolving folk magic practice, not to romanticize the past, not to appropriate spiritual practices from cultures that aren't my own, and to evolve it in such a way that, yes, it suits the present moment, and that present moment has a greater context, So there's some discernment needed here, where and when in the past you're drawing inspiration from in your folk magic, and also when you evolve a practice to suit the present day, to fulfill a spiritual need of modern life. It is important to kind of recognize, is there a bloodline connection to some living practice? Do you have a sense of lineage here? Is it total invention? Like, do some research. If you're taking something as inspiration and you're going to evolve it, it's like, is it a closed spiritual practice that traditionally one had to be born into? Or is it an open practice that you're confident can be like quite freely adapted? So like the witch ladders and not magic that I'm sharing, if we're being quite narrow about it, we could say, okay, it more or less comes out of a European folk tradition. We could say Mediterranean and West European folk tradition. But even then, it's like pretty difficult to find evidence, and like certainly nothing that implies that it was like a widespread practice, right? We could say these are localized practices. More confidently, when we look at these witch ladders, we could say it springs out of the Wiccan tradition, which is definitely an open practice that you do not need to be born into. And so therefore, you can most definitely adopt and adapt it freely. So that's not all I have to say about that, but that's my lecture on where do witch ladders like come from, and what should and shouldn't you do, and can you adapt it in any way you want? Like, yes, you can. I can't find it anymore, but like a number of years ago, I came across one article that did have some evidence showing that when that original Somerset witch ladder was presented through the Folklore Society, it was it wasn't James Fraser, but it was like one of his contemporaries. So like a very famous anthropologist was talking all about what he thought this cordage with feathers in it signified and the kind of magic it would have been. And in this article I read, it said that actually a good number of the local farmers who had heard about the anthropologists and the British Association for the Advancement of Science, like talking all about this, the farmers were like laughing themselves on the floor, rolling on the floor laughing, as we used to say, and saying that it was like a garland of feathers that would be tied across rows of peas to keep deer away, to keep them from going down the garden paths, the same way that we might like hang a string with some reflective, shiny, glittery plastic ribbon or something, to like keep the deer out of the garden. So even then, it's like kind of sus if it was even magic to begin with, So who knows what the truth originally was, but now we have a modern tradition of witch ladders, and we use them as a form of not magic for protection and manifestation, sometimes for cursing. So that's the kind of context. Where did they come from? Is it okay to adapt them? What are they? What do they do? So the main thing when you are creating a witch ladder is the intention. And all of the witch ladders that appear in the Spirited Kitchen were made with intention, and I just like gathered them from around my house and then like used thumbtacks to stick them all up on one wall. And my friend Steph, who photographed the whole book, took a photo of them. And some of them are more elaborate. That one that I said about like my family, when I read that intention, that is a real one. And you can do it any way you want. You can think about positive influences you'd like to anchor into your home over the next year. You can think about things you want to manifest. It could be very singular, like I just want to manifest prosperity or abundance. Or it could be like, I have a wish for every single member of my family, and or I have a wish that corresponds to every area of my life that's important, love, career, health, money, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, in essence, you are making a wish with this. Now in Wicca, they would sometimes use the spell of 9 knots by Doreen Valiente, and the Wiccans, they love their rhyming spells. So they would just do kind of one charm, and this spell of 9 knots would go like this. By knot of 1, the spell's begun. By knot of 2, it cometh true. By knot of 3, thus shall it be. By knot of 4, 'tis strengthened more. By knot of 5, so may it thrive. By knot of 6, the spell we fix. By knot of 7, the stars of heaven. By knot of 8, the hand of fate. By knot of 9, the thing is mine. It's kind of Disney, but it's also kind of cool. So you could just hold the intention privately in your mind, and for your 9 knots, you would say one of the lines of the rhyme. Now, as I said, the charm can be a verbal utterance to bless or to curse. You can, again, we know that charms have been used for like thousands of years because they're some of the first things that were ever written down. Like there's at least one archaeological dig of ancient Roman ruins that consists almost entirely of thousands of lead tablets with charms written on them. And actually that was a fun enrichment class we did in the Numinous School. This was like years ago, where I was talking about lead tablets and, showing evidence of all the different charms that were written then. Probably like the height of documented witchcraft is the 17th century in Europe, but maybe like as early as the 15th century. There's like a couple hundred years there where we see famous texts that seem to seamlessly blend medicine and magic. And so in that, we see a lot of charms, we see a lot of affirmations, and we can assume that, sometimes through some of the detail of what they were doing, but also other times we can tell by what they are writing down that they are using knots. These are knot magic was used and written about and sung about and talked about for, at least a couple hundred years. By the end of the 17th century in Europe, and like kind of around the Inquisition, of course, we're not seeing that as much. And in Russia, like up until Peter the Great made them illegal, like every house in Russia had a personal book of domestic medicine and magic recipes, and they would be filled with charms and spells. And, the Carmina Gadelica, which Alexander Carmichael wrote in, he gathered information in the mid-1800s in the Highlands. Again, it's like there was a period where things would have been written down, and then a period where the church clamped down from the Inquisition on, clamped down on that. And certainly the Church of Scotland did as well. And so the charms and spells then go back into sort of like oral history. And they start getting collected again in like the late 1800s. So the Carmina Gadelica is like from the Scottish Highlands and Islands, and it's this priest who went around and gathered all of these charms. But they're all just like little poems, and sometimes it seems like they're making a little potion, or it's just a blessing or a prayer. But other times you could definitely, there's a rhythm to it that's like, yeah, you could see that being for knot magic for sure. And in the charms, there's often certain things they use to anchor those words. They often start with an invocation of the directions, maybe cardinal directions, east, south, west, and north. Sometimes there's an invocation of allies, guides, ancestors, angels, saints, etc. Again, Carmina Gadelica, sometimes they will invoke a brownie. They will invoke the moon quite a bit, saints like Bridget for sure. In Mongolian, they have a phrase that's kind of like merciful mother, most effective support. So naming not only the ally, but their particular talent is very common. And that most merciful mother, most effective support, it's so beautiful. It also reminds me of my go-to invocation, which is simply Great Mother Spirit Creator. And so you would, start your magical practice with this invocation, either of the cardinal directions or of a great deity or of the moon, and then you would go into your intention and your declaration. So whatever it is that you are tying in to your magic. And they very often use metaphors as well. So a lot of the charms that they use have metaphors or comparisons to some kind of precedent. So they would say stuff like, as the rain pours down on me, may your favor wash over me. Or as the twine binds, so the blessing does me find. I think most of these are from In the Bathhouse at Midnight, by the way, if you're wondering. The strength of the knot, the power of the will. Actually, I shouldn't say most. I think just a few of these. I've collected them all in my grimoire, so I'm sorry I can't tell you exactly where I got all of these, but I'm happy to keep sharing them with you. So yeah, the strength of the knot, the power of the will. Or as you, deity, did XYZ, please may you do the same for me. Another one that I will use is my word is firm, firmer than the strength of heroes. As you stand tall and strong in the wind, great deity, may I stand firm in my power. Or as your bones live in my hand beyond death, may my wish be granted in perpetuity. And so that one's to the ancestors, like my bones are your bones. As your bones live in my hand beyond death, may my wish be granted in perpetuity. I suppose you could use that if you had a physical bone too as your witch ladder. Or as I tie the threads of fate, may my destiny be so bound. And then so you're doing your not magic, you're doing your verbal utterances, your charms, then you would finish with something. You tie the last knot and utter a binding charm. And again, it could be super simple, and so it is, or it could be the deity's name, stand with me. I think this also from the Carmina Gadelica, like a magic charm between this house and harm. Another one is, therefore, by this knotting or by this binding, so does my wish come to pass. In the name of the deity, it is done. Some people will use the Latin et credo, which is kind of like I believe, which is like just affirming, I believe this will come to pass. There's an offering, or there's a Mongolian one that I like that says, wonderful offering is happening. I love the present tense, like a wonderful offering is happening right now. It's kind of like, come hither, spirits, come help. And, you could also just keep it simple with thank you, thank you, thank you, or blowing into the object, like, blowing your prayer out into the cosmos. In the case of cursing, sometimes people add something a little bit more foreboding. The one that I remember, I don't really remember too many good curses, but just saying, and you will remember me. That one, that does have a cursing kind of vibe to it. Now, I've had people ask me, what do you do with a witch ladder when you're finished with it? And I gotta say, I'm always sort of like, I draw a blank with that question because it's a question I would never even think to ask exactly. Not that it's an invalid question. I just mean like it's so far outside my paradigm. Like I have witch ladders in every room and I love them so much and I find it very hard to let them go. So I'm like, what do you mean when you're finished with it? It's true that like, the magic will wear off. And if your prayer has come to pass, you don't really need it up anymore. But I just feel like I'm never finished with them. I always love them so much. But when I do deconstruct them, I generally will deconstruct with intention. I don't do it in like a hasty way. I don't do it in a harsh way. I try to undo the knots rather than cut things off, And I will place all the objets on my altar for a little while, just to acknowledge and offer thanks for the blessings and to almost like give them like a little spa day, like I'll just put them all back on the altar as like a sacred place for them to rest and recharge and kind of be cleansed and purified and like come back into the fold, And sometimes I put offerings there on the altar with them, new, fresh offerings, or like a little piece of paper, just writing down like, thank you for blessings received. So yeah, like as an ex voto kind of thing. And then I would keep the components that I want to keep with my witchcraft apothecary. Like I would take the good reusable things and put it back in the apothecary. And then the parts that I want to compost or like return to the land somehow, I'll just do so with a lot of gratitude and respect. I might still end up just putting them in the compost bin or the food scraps bag or whatever, but I'm doing it saying thank you. And really that, my friends, maybe that is all I have to say about witch ladders now. Probably more than anyone needs to know about witch ladders. And my editor, Isabel, was right. It was just fine as like half a page, but I hope it helped you pass the time today in a good way, especially if you were making witch ladders or doing not magic. Do check the show notes in your podcast player or at numinouspodcast.com so you can see examples of witch ladders that I and other Numini and like fans of the Spirited Kitchen have made. They're really beautiful, really inspiring. I'm not the best at like cataloging all the things I get tagged in over the course of a year. So I wish I'd kept all the witch ladder posts and things in a like organized way from past years, but I will put images and links in the show notes. I will find some for sure. And again, if you like this episode, you want to leave a question or feedback or anything like that for me, you can always reach out at castfeedback.com/numinouspodcast. You can leave me a voice note or a written note, And I'll link to that in the Numinous Network, I'll link to that in the show notes as well. My listener shout out today is a little different. I just want to say hi to whoever's listening in Latvia recently. I see you binging the Numinous podcast, and I think that's awesome. And I hope you're having a good time and enjoying the show. I can tell that you are some really awesome person. I doubt there's anyone else. I bet you it's just one person in Latvia, because it went from like 0 downloads to like pretty consistent. You must be listening on your way to work or something like that. But I really am quite charmed by that. And I would love it if you would leave me feedback or a review. I'd love to know like what keeps you coming back. And I will make sure that I try to keep that up. Anyway, thank you, Latvia. One person in Latvia, so much for listening. It just feels so connective. It makes the globe feel a lot smaller. And it's really heartwarming. Thank you. Okay, the last thing today. If you are an over-functioning caregiver, you will probably want to check out my new gut-directed hypnotherapy program. It's on demand for audio and video. You could start anytime just by joining the Numinous Network. And it's like a visit to the spa for your gut-brain axis. Participants have said things in the comments in the online forum like, after 2 weeks in this course, using it at bedtime along with bedtime supplements, I fall right to sleep. And sometimes when I wake up during the night, I listen again. I feel like my baseline everyday overwhelm and stress level has improved. After 2 weeks, I love that. So this program supports symptom management for folks suffering from disorders of the gut-brain interaction. And so just think about like all the overlapping syndromes, right? IBS, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS, MCAS, reflux hypersensitivity, functional abdominal pain. And so you'll have support for that digestive stuff, but also to reduce symptoms of fatigue, post-exertional malaise, sleep disturbance, pain, and some of the other like autonomic and neuroendocrine issues. So as I said, you can start immediately. It's all on demand. There's a forum and a chat function to connect with fellow participants, and also just like crowdsource information from people who have gone through what you've gone through, of like some mystery symptoms that become a mysterious syndrome with probably not as much support as would be helpful from conventional medical systems, right? So I also just want to give you the heads up, once or twice a month, we have a live connection session in the network for folks with sensitive nervous systems. And if you have any of the diagnoses I listed or like mystery symptoms, well, you probably have a sensitive nervous system, you know? So this program can help even if your symptoms are new or highly dynamic and really variable. All you have to do is join this in the Numinous Network to get started. You can find out more at carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. And I hope I'll see you tomorrow. Till next time, take care.